Hello everyone. Today we're going to be exploring the virtues of the Western world. I've been doing a little bit of reading here and there, and I'd like to share some of my thoughts on this idea. So strap yourselves in, this is going to be a little bit of a long one, but I think it's going to be worth it. So first off, we have to answer the question of what is virtue? And we have to turn, I think, to some founding philosophers when it comes to virtue. And this would be Aristotle for me. And his theory on virtue ethics, I think, is very good. It's not complete, but it's a very good starting point for understanding how we should behave, what we should strive for, what are our ideals. Well, in the Aristotelian world, virtue means excellence, to do something well. You might think of a virtuoso pianist or violin player. They're excellent at what they do. They're very skilled. And when it comes to morality and ethics, which is essentially the study of human behavior, and we're looking to virtue as a way to guide our actions, what are the best possible behaviors that we can engage in order to form a more moral society? And I think that the Western world has several thousand years of moral tradition, of philosophy that have gone into how we've ended up today. Not all of it good, not all of it bad, most of it very positive. But a lot of people, in particular men in the Western world, have lost this virtuous spirit. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. But let's explore Aristotle's view on virtues just a little bit further. So to Aristotle, there are two types of virtue, two main types, moral and intellectual virtue. And this comes down to the difference between moral character and moral thought, or the morality of the mind. Now, I'm going to only focus on moral character because this video is probably going to be long enough as it is. Maybe I'll do moral intellect in another video, but these ideas on moral virtues are very interesting because they're sort of similar in a way to the moral objectivists, and that's sort of a relative absolute when it comes to behavior. So these virtues are absolute because no matter what, you ought to develop these virtues. But they are relative in a way because everyone will develop virtues in accordance with their circumstances. And to me, this absolute relativity is an interesting concept. I'm not going to base too much on it, but it's some food for thought. But moral virtues, really, when it comes to behavior, you need to aim between the mean of two extremes, meaning you have an extreme of deficiency, which is too little, and an extreme of excess, which is too much. And every virtue is between these two vices. And virtue and vice are just about habitual behavior, not dispositions to act in a certain way. For example, you are not a virtuous person just if you simply donate a little bit of money to someone once. The act in and of itself may be virtuous, but it does not make you a virtuous person until it becomes a behavior that you are constantly engaged in. And that's really the most important thing here, is that these virtues are not just things that you do every now and again. These are rules that you live by. These are habitual behaviors that define who you are and how you shape society. Of course, being a sort of collectivist, you have to understand that the collective is made up of individuals. And if each one of the individuals is following this sort of virtuousness, then eventually you will end up with a collective that is virtuous. So let's take, for example, the virtue of charity. So you're stuck between the vice of being stingy or cheap, kind of scheming, and the vice of monetary recklessness. You shouldn't be reckless with your money because that's endangering your family, your ability to survive, things like that. So in this Aristotelian moral virtuousness, the virtuous or excellent thing to do would be the mean, which would be regulated generosity. You should be charitable with your wealth to the people who are in your in-group. Being stingy is a vice, but you have to be mindful of reckless spending that can ruin you financially and disrupt the world around you. If you were to go out and spend all of your money to feed all of these homeless people, well, now you've screwed yourself and you probably won't be able to give anymore if you screw yourself financially. If you have an ability to collect resources and you ruin it by wasting all of that potential, you are helping less people in the end. These virtues have a lot to do about being mindful of your behavior. But not just that. In the Aristotelian worldview, rationality is also very important. So when you're looking at a behavior, you should try and rationalize what the most excellent form of that behavior is. This idea that every behavior is stuck between two extremes or two vices. Another very common example when we talk about this Aristotelian virtue ethics is the idea of bravery. To be brave is to be excellent, and bravery is stuck between two vices. The act of cowardice, which is not enough bravery, and the act of recklessness, which is too much bravery. As a soldier, you should not blindly jump into combat if you can rationally understand that it will lead to your destruction. But on the other hand, soldiers who are cowards are not soldiers at all. So you have to be mindful and rational about your behavior. And this leads to virtuousness, to excellence. And this excellence, I think, is something we need to bring back to the world. Okay, now we understand what virtues are and how they can be applied in this sort of gradient between two vices, this mean average kind of behavior. Okay, we get that. Now, what are the virtues that are traditional in the Western world? And I've made sort of a flow chart, sort of a hierarchy of virtues that I think is very important. And this will sort of tie in with my hierarchy of moral values. I'll do another video on that, but this is simply talking about the virtue ethics. And it starts off with the virtues of the self. And if you can contain yourself and be virtuous on an individual level, you can externalize that and be virtuous in your behavior to the outgroup. And in turn, it's almost as if there is a domino effect. When one person is virtuous, that behavior rubs off on other people as well. I'll go in depth in that in just a minute. But from that, when we start from the self and we turn outwards, we externalize these virtues, we come across a forked path. And one of them is the virtues of duty, the virtues of honor, this sort of moral code, this virtuous code that we should strive to live for. And on the other hand, we have a classical tradition. These are the virtues of the classical world. Some people may call this the virtues of the Greek philosophers, you could say. But these are the virtues that the ancient world taught us, that the ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates taught us. Once you now combine these two realms of virtue, you end up with the virtues of the state and governance. And the Western world has a long history of varying philosophies when it comes to the state. Again, I'll get into that soon. Now, there's one that is outside of this flow chart. And why is that? Well, these are the virtues of cooperation. These virtues have more to do with biological imperatives. Now, biological imperatives in and of themselves are not virtues. It's simply an explanation or an understanding of the human nature. And this will be important. I'll talk about this more before we go into the virtue systems. But these virtues of cooperation are important because it relates very closely to how humans operate in the natural world. So on that note, let's look at these biological imperatives, things that are innate to human nature. And you can think of this as the rational versus the non-rational. These things are non-rational. These are things that just happen. The way that you feel, the urges you have are purely natural. They're irrational. They're hard to control. Now, I think that through the application of virtue, you can control these natural urges, but to control them, first you must understand exactly what they are. And this has a lot to do with the sphere of morality and the Aristotelian ideas, but you can also refer, if you're not satisfied with my retelling of these biological imperatives, I would encourage you to go look and read about Thomas Aquinas's basic goods. It's very similar to this. He just throws in a little bit more religion. So let's look at these now. The first one is appetite. The inherent craving for material possessions, including the necessities to survive. Every human being has an innate drive to gather and consume resources as it relates to survival. This is the reason why we get up in the morning, the reason why we eat, the reason why we seek certain types of pleasure and food, because it's hardwired into us to want to seek these things. It is a perfectly natural thing. Now, of course, if you don't tame this beast, it leads to things like gluttony and lust and other various sins. But again, the whole point of this is that we can temper these emotions or non-rational behaviors. So the next one is aversion, and this is an interesting one. Aversion is a natural dislike or desire to avoid a thing, a person, or a behavior or set of behaviors. And every human being seems to have an intuitive dislike of certain things. We dislike people, things, and behaviors that may lead us to harm, that may lead us to sickness. We stay away. We have an aversion to waste. We have an aversion to areas where there are predators. We have natural inclinations to be against the degenerate acts that many people are engaged in the Western world. These things are perfectly natural. The next one is reproduction, and this one is very important as a biological imperative. The need to pass on genetic material and produce the next generation of persons is innate. It's hardwired into all of us. It's hardwired into all life forms, in fact, to reproduce, whether it's a single cellular organism or the most complex of animals, you could say, is the human. It's innate, and it should be recognized as something that is non-rational, and it's something that we can control and should control. The next one is security. All human beings and most animals have a need to feel safe and secure in their environment, and this sort of relates to the procurement of resources as well, but you have an innate want to feel secure, to feel comfortable where you are, because this means that you're not in danger. Your brain says, hey, this is good, you're not in danger, you have a better chance of surviving. In fact, your body will tell you to keep doing things that are comfortable because it's easy, it's good for your survival. And again, these things should be tempered. The next one is competition. Natural forces drive humans to compete with one another and create hierarchies. This is a natural, observable fact of all pack animals like humans. We have a natural need to form groups because Providence has seen fit to make us form these groups because it is a better way to survive. Solitary humans are shit at surviving in the natural world, but we can group together, and as I've said in many of my political theory videos, collective power is always stronger than individual power. And especially in the natural world, to form a tribe is to have a better chance of surviving. So this is a natural process. And the final thing is identity formation. Much like competition and the formation of groups, these natural forces dictate that certain organisms, humans, must form these groups in order to increase their chances of survival. So the two kind of interplay off one another. But I wanted to touch on this to differentiate between hierarchies and identity. They both sort of relate to groups, but your identity is key in making your brain feel like, or tricking your brain into believing that you are a part of a group that is going to help increase your chances of survival. It's natural, it's non-rational, it's something that you might want to temper or control, but it exists, it's there, there's not much you can do about it unless you try a social engineering experiment like communists do in trying to create this new socialist man, which is, of course, extremely destructive, which is why it's so important to understand that this is a natural process. Okay, so now we understand the driving forces behind how humans behave. Now we can seek to control these behaviors in a productive way. The reason why we even form societies or groups in the first place is because it's more productive, which leads to better survivability. But these traditional Western virtues don't necessarily have to be atheistic or agnostic. They can come from God. These two schools of thought can work together in this idea of naturally occurring law, whether it comes from a force we don't know yet, which would be the agnostic viewpoint, or whether it comes from God. These laws have been handed down by a higher power to humans. They exist, they're observable, they're there, and we need to do something about it. We need to decide, we need to be rational about whether or not we're going to control these behaviors or just let them run loose. Now, obviously, once you run through that scenario rationally, you would say that some of these behaviors, or most, need to be tempered in some way. So how do we do that? Well, we do that through the system of virtues. And these are the virtues I think that the West has idealized or romanticized in the past. And they're not perfect. No human being is perfect. No one lives up to 100% of these standards, but it's something that drives you forward. It's something to look towards. It's an abstract concept that kind of motivates you and keeps you going. These are modes of behavior that we should strive for. So when we're talking about virtues of the self, a couple of things really pop up to me. The first one is prudence. Now, prudence is the ability to govern and discipline oneself by the use of reason, skill, and good judgment. You have prudence if you are a rational person. You can use your skill and judgment to analyze a situation and act accordingly. And there is a long history in the Western world of using rationality to solve problems. So we should use this good judgment. We should hold this good judgment as a virtue. The next one is justice, righteousness, the administration of what is just. It's the assignment of merit rewards or punishments based on truth. To be just is a virtue. Nobody likes, and society cannot work if everyone is a liar, a deceiver, someone who obfuscates the truth. You must be just in your actions. That is a virtue, and it's an important virtue in the Western world. Western men should be held to higher standards of justice and righteousness. The next one is temperance, and this is very important. This is the habitual moderation and the indulgence of the appetites, as I said in the biological imperatives, or the passions, which is emotions and instinct. You should be able to temper your thoughts, to overcome emotion, to be a stoic in some aspects. Fueling your behavior purely on emotions like anger leads to irrationality, and this is not a good way to run society, and it is not necessarily how the Western world has run society. There is a temperance to the minds of man. They are very mindful of how they are and how they hold themselves. And this, again, all of these things sort of interrelate with one another. Temperance and rationality can lead to justice, which leads to righteousness, and throw some prudence in there. But the next one is fortitude. And fortitude is strength of the mind. This is your ability to encounter danger or bear pain with courage. And to survive in the harsh reality that we find ourselves in on this planet, you need to have fortitude. You need to be strong. And that ties into the last virtue of the self, as I identify it, is strength. And strength is the pure force of will. It's the physical strength in training. It's your capacity for endurance. And if you're strong physically, you can become strong mentally. And that leads to temperance, to prudence, which eventually leads to righteousness. And if you are just, you can apply that to the virtues of duty. And the virtues of duty are the next set of virtues that are very, very important when it comes to discussing society and how we behave, how we interact with one another in society. So let's move on to the virtues of duty. And the first one is faith. And this is an interesting one. You're an atheist, you're an agnostic, how can you have faith? Well, faith isn't inherently religious. It's a part of it, but not inherent. Faith is an allegiance to duty or to a person, to a thing. It's belief and trust in something higher than yourself as an individual. And this is, I think, very virtuous. I believe in the abstract concept of the group, of the society, of the state, things like this. I have faith in the people around me that we're going to cooperate and be productive with one another. And if everyone has faith in this way, we can truly see peace and cooperation, which will come up later. The next one is hope. And hope, really, it's just the cherishing of a higher idealistic desire. It's similar to faith, but slightly different. It can be a little bit more ambiguous. Hope just means that you have something to strive for, something abstract. I hope that my society will flourish. I hope that my neighbors are kind to me. I hope that I can be charitable or be successful or have good fortune. And this hope leads to the destruction of nihilism. And I think that many people have understood that having hope as a virtuous act can lead to great things. Having hope for the future, for the next generation, spurs you into action. I have hope, and this goes back to fortitude. I have hope that tomorrow will be better, that I can get through these hard times. To have hope is an extremely important behavior, I think, that is kind of overlooked. And the next one is charity. We talked a little bit about charity earlier and the spectrum of charity between the two vices. But charity is just benevolent goodwill or love for your kin and for the society as a collective. The people around you, whether it's your family or your in-group, your nation, if you want to extend it to the race as an extended family. Now, this is not an endorsement of egalitarianism, wealth redistribution, things like that, horrible things like that. No. I'll paraphrase here the words of a great leader, and that we're not asking the rich to give to the poor. We're not going to take their resources from them and give them to the poor. We're asking the rich to help out people of their society, to help members of their racial group, their religious group, to help their kin and their family. You should have some form of empathy, and if we do that, we uplift the society. We should hold charity as a virtue, because if everyone is acting charitably, is acting in accordance with this virtue system, then you will see society become more productive, because there's more hope, there's more cooperation between people. You are able to support each other, one another as a collective in hard times. It makes a lot of sense to hold charity as a virtue, and we have for a long time. In fact, I still think that it's one of the most talked about virtues nowadays even. The next one is one that is not talked about very often, and that is decency. But you might be wondering what decency is, because you probably heard it before, but you've never heard it explained as a virtue. But decency is really, it's conformity to conditions considered essential for a proper standard of living. I have decency in that I don't walk around naked. People don't want to see me naked walking around. It's not a decent way to live. I don't act like a degenerate because it's not a decent way to live. It's not productive. People don't want to see it, whether they have this instinctual aversion to my behavior or not. Decency is really just a respect for the collective society around you. And if everyone acted decently, there would be an increase in the quality of life. And I think this is one of the important things that the Western world understood, whether subconsciously or not, that to act decently uplifts the society much like charity does. And the last duty, and this one is very important and has fallen out of fashion, is that of honor. Honor is a very high virtue. But honor simply, it's a keen sense of ethical conduct. It's integrity. It's you recognizing the holiness of covenants or contracts or agreements. Your word is your bond, is law, so on and so forth. Honor needs to be a virtue in order for us to productively cooperate with one another. And of course, if you've studied anything about the pre-Christian cultures of Europe, for a long time, there have been honor codes. In fact, there's honor codes found all over the world because it is a high virtue. Men and women should be honorable towards one another. Men should have honorable relationships with other men. This is how we should conduct ourselves. Now let's look at the virtues of the classical world. And these are a little bit more vague, a little bit more abstract, but some of the greatest Greek philosophers have talked about these virtues before, and I think it makes a lot of sense if you look at the tradition of the Western world. And the first one is beauty. And beauty is just a reverence for the qualities of a person or thing that gives pleasure to the senses, mind, or spirit. When we make beautiful things like artwork, the importance of aesthetic has been around in Western culture for thousands of years. We can recognize beauty. I don't think that beauty is subjective. I think there is an objective beauty to things. Maybe that's just my cultural imperialist side talking, but I think that we have the capability to produce aesthetically pleasing things. And people who have a reverence for beauty are able to create beautiful societies, and that's something that we're lacking today. The next one is truth, or rationality, you could say. And of course, we get into the argument of what is truth, the Peterson versus Harris argument. I'm not going to go into that, but truth is just your sincerity in action and character and the things that you say. We are just seeking to find reality as it applies to things, events, and people. This searching for the truth also leads us to our righteousness as a virtue, but it also leads to the sciences. We want to understand or explore reality, and this is what has led to the creation of the modern world and our modern technologies. Now, you can say what you will about technologies, but we have created some astounding things, and I think we have that capability, but we've sort of lost this virtue of truth. Now, many people innately try to be truthful because they've been raised in Western tradition, and one of the traditional Western values is the seeking of truth. But we need to enumerate it. We need to realize that this is a very important virtue to have, is to be truthful. The next one is a little bit more vague, but I think if I try and explain it here, you might be able to understand. And that's the concept of goodness. And goodness is really, it's a striving for moral excellence and virtue. It's sort of the whole reason why I'm talking about this at all. It's striving for an abstract form of behavior. It's an excellence in the quality of your character. I want to be excellent. You know, I think I sound like Bill and Ted when I say something like that. You know, like, be excellent, my dudes. But you understand what I'm trying to say. We should be excellent in our character. We should strive for a higher ideal in our behaviors. And the last one that comes from the old world, the classical world, is the virtue of wisdom. And this, I think, we're very much lacking, and this was very important in the old world. And wisdom is the application, keep in mind the application, of acquired knowledge. And as this applies to your attitude, your beliefs, and the way that you hold yourself, the way that you act. And there's a significant lack of wisdom nowadays. You could almost say that it's sort of common sense, but not really, because wisdom can only be attained through experience, at least according to the classical philosophers. So let's move on quickly through the virtues of the state and governance, because we have a tradition of Western values when it comes to the state, and they vary over time, no doubt about that, but there are some general trends that we can hold as behaviors. The first one is providence, and this one kind of confused me when I first came across it, but I think I've explained it pretty succinctly. Foreseeing the guidance of God or nature over the earth as it applies to governance. That's what providence is, having the knowledge to apply natural law to how we govern ourselves. And this goes back to the natural or biological imperative. In the Western world, in Western tradition, in philosophy and politics, we have always tried to describe what the natural behaviors of man are and how we can temper that or control that through politics. And it's very important, I think, to hold this providence as a virtue, because if you cannot describe how people act, you cannot possibly form a coherent political outlook. And the next one, as it kind of relates to this, is the virtue of natural law. And this just means that you recognize the rights of man as set forth by God or nature, and their enumeration by the state. Now, I've done videos in the past where I talk about the role of the state as a tool and its absolutist, and that it does enumerate these natural rights. And I think it's important in Western tradition to understand that we have come to understand this natural law, and that it's very important in forming a coherent political outlook. The next one is civility, and this is one that we seem to overlook, not just as it applies to governance, but how it applies to our interactions with one another. And civility is the expression of civil conduct. It's a higher ideal of courtesy and politeness that we extend to members of our society and in the state. When you're dealing with the state, it's better to be civil than to beat each other with clubs. If we're going to form a stable society, there needs to be an ounce of civility thrown in there. You know, as unproductive as I think Congress and the Senate are in the United States, at least they're semi-civil with one another. It does not break out into a barroom fight every time that these representatives get together. That's at least one positive. But to counter this, we have the virtue of austerity. And austerity is just the equalizer of civility. because austerity is an ideal of stern attitudes. You must have the prudence or the temperance to understand when it is time to apply civility and when it is time to apply austerity. These two things play off of one another. You must be stern in your judgments every now and again. You can be civil, and there's a time for civility, but there's a time for austerity. In the same vein that there is a time for peace and a time for war. You have to know when to apply the sword and when to apply the olive branch. And I think this is very important when it deals to matters of the state. So let's move on to the final one, which is the virtues of cooperation. And these are, again, sort of abstract, and they're more related to biological imperatives and the nature of man, but I think it's very important. We should strive for these things. It's not an absolute law that we have to uphold, but it's something that we should strive for when possible. And the first one is peace. Peace is the wanting for freedom from civil disturbance. It's a reverence for a state of being that is tranquil or harmonious. We should strive for peace because peace is productive. Most of the time, I should say. There's probably a few caveats in there, but would you rather live in a society that is constantly murdering one another in constant warfare? Or would you rather live in a society that is peaceful and productive with one another? Again, temperance, prudence, austerity. There are times to be stern, but generally we should strive to be peaceful in our existence with one another in our society. And the next one is love. Love is a virtue. And love is just this unselfish, benevolent concern. It's a concern for the good of your family, your kin, and your society, or for your racial group. You should have love for other people because I know it's cheesy, but they say love makes the world go round, and this is fairly true. You can't cooperate with other people if they hate you. Certainly not. And there is a degree of love that has to go into parenting, into interpersonal relationships, a love for the land around you, and a love for nature. This is a very high virtue, and I think it's a very important thing. The next one is tranquility. Tranquility is really just a wanting for your mind, body, and soul to be free from agitation, disturbance, or turmoil. And this is separate from peace because tranquility is really to be in harmony with not only the people around you, but in nature. There is a balance between reckless destruction and pollution of the earth and sort of neutering yourself economically. The exploitation, for lack of a better term, of natural resources is good, but we should have the temperance and the prudence and the self-introspection to say, hey, let's not pollute the world. Let's find that mean between two extremes. That is the tranquility of our existence as it applies to people and nature. And the final one is empathy. And empathy, to understand it or to be aware of others in your society and their experiences. If we're going to cooperate with one another, we have to understand that we are people as well, that we have our own experiences, our own thoughts. You cannot run around thinking of people as mindless robot, zombie slaves, whatever, because that leads to destructive things like murder and theft. If you don't see other people as human beings, you're more likely to commit immoral acts. And in our ideal society, we don't want to go around raping and murdering one another, right? That's not something that we do in our Western civilized societies. So now we've reached the end. These virtues, these systems of behavior that come from the Western tradition, I think is what made us so great in the past, and we've lost most of it. But I'd like to hear from you. Are there any other virtues that you'd like to include in this list? Are there any things that you dispute in this list, or any questions that you may have? Leave me a comment down below or find me on social media. And if you've made it this far, thank you so very much for watching.